So a London council becomes the first in England to advise schools to close from tonight and move teaching online. Greenwich Council says coronavirus cases there have reached their highest level than any time since March. The London mayor backs the move and would like all schools in the capital to close from as early as tomorrow, as we face being moved into Tier 3 later this week. It's likely most of the schools will comply, although academy and free schools are not obliged to. The Department of Education says keeping schools open remains a national priority. Let's talk about this to Kevin Courtney, the Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union. Morning, Kevin.
Good morning, Vanessa.
I mean, this is exactly what the government did not want to happen. Absolutely central to their philosophy of coming out of lockdown was that children would go to school and the schools would remain open. So what do you make of this? What do you make of the leader of Greenwich Council saying, no, ours are closing?
Well, we think that he's making the right decision and that Sadiq Khan is making the right decision to say that schools should close. It's not long till the end of term. The government has said that schools should have an inset day on Friday. So it's only 4 days in some ways. But in those 4 days, cases can really increase dramatically. And as the Mayor of London says in his letter to government, the biggest spread of the virus in the capital is within education settings and specifically amongst the 10 to 19-year-old age group. So he's looking at the data, saying that's where cases are increasing. He's worried about what happens in the let-up over Christmas that, obviously people want to see. And he's also, our concern is that 1,000 extra cases now can be 3,000 extra cases when you're in the close confines of meeting with your family next week.
Yes, well, that is what's happening. In London, we're doubling the cases every day, aren't we, at the moment? Is that what's going on? I mean, the figures are shooting up here, aren't they?
That's the real concern. And it's not, as a physics teacher, I'd say it's not arithmetic growth, it's geometric growth. Right. So that it keeps, it's on that exponential curve. And so hitting it now hard is the best way to do it. And what we're finding in schools is, actually, you did the presentation of this in the thing that you just said more effectively than I have been. We're seeing just chaos in schools because lots of parents are keeping their children off this week because they want to see grandparents next week and they want to keep their children isolated. They're seeing the same as we are, that, the national figures that on the national average, 2% of secondary students have got the virus, 1% of primary students have got the virus. We know that cases can be a lot higher in some places, and we think they're higher in London than those national averages now. So not every child has got it, but you don't know which children have got it because so many of them have it asymptomatically. So if you are thinking of seeing grandparents, there is a real element of concern that people have got. So for that reason, schools are feeling fairly chaotic at the moment anyway. At
the beginning, we were told children don't get it and children don't spread it. I remember being told to say at one point, there's not a single case or something of a child infecting a teacher, or do you remember that? That was at the very, very beginning. That seemed to change. That scenario seemed to change pretty sharpish, really, didn't it?
That has changed in... we were always really skeptical of that and saying we were skeptical of it right from the beginning. Yeah. We are still saying that children don't suffer it. If the child gets the coronavirus, they don't suffer it in the vast, vast majority of cases. But the sage scientists...
Although I think that by now we all know that there are children who really have had a horrible dose of it. I mean, for example, Darren Rodwell, the lead of Barking and Dagenham Council, his 11-year-old has it, little girl, and she's really been unwell with it. And, I think anecdotally more and more people know children who've had it. I'm sure that the vast majority of them don't end up in intensive care, but they can be very unwell though, can't they?
That's right. But that's not what's driving these decisions, I think, is the scientists are still saying that the vast majority of children don't suffer it badly. But what they are now accepting is that they do transmit it to other adults. So it's not just the children, it's the whole community. And the best place for transmission is in the family home. You're not outside. It's not ventilated. You are cuddling up on the sofa, watching the TV together. That's where it spreads most effectively. And so the concern is not as much about the illness of children, or like you say, some children do suffer it, but that's not true for the vast majority of children. But it is the concern for grandparents. A 70-year-old who contracts the virus, most of them don't die, but it's the same level of risk as somebody going up Everest. And most people wouldn't do that, and so there is a really high level of risk if a 70-year-old gets it, and people are thinking, how do they protect them?
But Kevin, some people listening to this will just be thinking, oh, for goodness sake, they've only just gone back. They're already so behind. We keep getting all these different estimates of just how behind most children are and how difficult it's going to be to keep up. And the exams next year have to be specially tailor-made for children who have fallen behind, which they all have, and it's not their fault. And also they're lonely and they're bored. They get depressed if they're at home. They get thoroughly fed up. Some schools are quite good at Zooming lessons. Some are absolutely hopeless and don't even try. It just means that the unequal playing field gets even less equal, and that the kind of mental health situation gets more and more dire if they don't go to school, doesn't it? I mean, lots of people will just be thinking, you've only just gone back. For heaven's sake, it's only 4 more days. Don't close the schools before Christmas.
So my union certainly supported schools being back open in September. We'd been pressing for things to keep them safer. Those things weren't provided. We didn't have testing for children, if you remember, in September. They just hadn't prepared the ground for that. There are some times when it's sensible to close schools for a short period because it suppresses cases really well and it keeps the average attendance higher. So we've reached in the last weeks where 20% of secondary children aren't in school at any one time. And you will know from anecdotes, sometimes that's one child in year 11 who's had 3 periods of 2 weeks being off because public health advice says they should. That's really disruptive. Whereas we had advocated a 2-week close down over half term, putting them into a circuit break at that time that the government unfortunately turned its head against, because we know that suppresses cases and that gets them down lower in schools, and then more children would be in schools for more time.
So what do you think are the chances that the government will agree to this and will get on stream with the Mayor of London and will close schools from tomorrow or from this evening or something like that?
I really hope that they will. I think that they won't. I think that they have decided politically that they want schools open at all costs. But if that's the road they go down, I really think that's a poor line for them. But if they're going to go down that line, then they do need to lead a sensible conversation with parents about whether you keep grandparents safe, whether you meet grandparents over the Christmas period. If children are in schools right up till the end, then a lot of them will be carrying the virus. So the government has got a choice. Either it supports these London councils in making this sensible decision, and I think that more London councils might start backing it as well, or it really has to have that conversation with parents about how to assess the risk over the Christmas period. The Mayor is saying the right thing here. Cases are surging in secondary schools in particular, but in education settings, it's a sensible move to suppress the cases before we get into Christmas.
Thank you very much for talking to us. Kevin Courtney there, Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union.